This is meeting 125 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, September 23rd, 2024, the committee is commencing its study of recent developments concerning the Canada-United States softwood lumber trade dispute. We have with us today from the British Columbia Lumber Trade Council by video conference Kurt Niquette, and from the Institute of Research of Economic, Robert LaPlante, Managing Director, also by video conference. Welcome to you all. We will start with opening remarks and then proceed with rounds of questions. You have up to 5 minutes, gentlemen. Mr. Niquette, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you and the committee today. My name is Kurt Niquette. I am the president of the BC Lumber Trade Council, and I represent the majority of softwood lumber producers in British Columbia. The BC forest sector contributes significantly to the economy. In 2022, the industry supported 100,000 jobs, contributed over $17 billion to GDP, and provided $6 billion to government revenue. Forest products are BC's second largest export category, and BC is the largest lumber producing region in Canada. We represent about 40% of our exports to the United States. Since the expiration of the last softwood lumber agreement in 2016, over $10 billion worth of duties have been collected and now sit on deposit. Duties recently increased to about 14% and are projected to double next year. The duties have an effect of raising prices in the U.S., hurting U.S. consumers of softwood lumber. They also have a significant impact on the Canadian sector, lowering production and employment, which hurts thousands of communities that rely on forestry. Canada's share of the U.S. market has dropped from over 30% to around 24% today. In its place, there has been increased U.S. production as well as increased imports from European countries that are not subject to duties. While the duties are unjustified and unfair, the CUSMA dispute mechanism process has been very slow and needs improvement. This long-standing fight needs to end. The BC industry stands shoulder to shoulder and will continue to work with governments to reach a new agreement. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. LaPlante, please.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear members of the committee, I am happy to communicate with you the reactions that we have as terms of researchers in the Institut de Recherche en Économie Contemporaine. And we are looking at the role of the forestry industry in the Quebec economy and also in international trade over several years now. And it has not taken us by surprise to see that once again, the question of duty rate has led to significant litigation between the US and Canada. And in this respect, I don't think we can refer to a true crisis situation. Of course, the imposition of these duties, as has been said by the previous speaker, is unfounded and illegitimate to a certain extent, but we cannot refer to a true crisis even if it has led to certain market disturbances. If we wanted to describe these market disturbances as a crisis, we would have to bear in mind that, in fact, this is part of an overall pattern which has characterized the US's behavior on this matter. And it's not a question of interpretation of legislation or laws, but rather it's a question of power play. And That is why duties have been imposed, and in the past, certain bodies have allowed us to see that this point of view was justified and that Canada certainly was justified in asking for certain corrections to be made. But this legislation has not removed the power play. It has just shifted the power balance or imbalance. We've got a question of competition as well, with the use of customs duties. And consensus has been reached amongst Democrats and Republicans in Washington on this issue. We have to look at what has happened in previous years. It seems that certain decisions were handed down, but we seem to have missed the boat. So there needs to be a true significant restructuring of the Canadian industry. Reforms have to lead the industry towards a better creation of market value. Softwood lumber in crisis because certain uses are no longer so relevant and are being replaced by other commodities. So in the Canadian industry, we need to shift towards added value products. Previous meetings should have shown us that we needed to react more quickly within the Canadian industrial sector. Quebec has reformed its forestry system and is now in full compliance with the expectations from our US counterparts. But in spite of the adjustments that have been made, nothing can actually calm down this dispute. In fact, what could perhaps calm troubled waters would be a shift in industry and our economic forces towards other possible niches, so that there could be powerful incentives to actually revitalize the industry. And part of the production could shift from commodities towards finished, higher processed products. So we have an opportunity to bring together an industrial policy and marry that with our trade interests by fully benefiting from the housing crisis, which means there needs to be further efforts made by the construction industry, and there needs to be incentive measures, and there needs to be an industrial policy developed in an appropriate manner so that Canadian companies can take a larger share of the finished processed products that are sold on the domestic market, so that these industries would be in a better position for exports towards the US and also towards other possible export markets, because being too dependent on the US market makes us more vulnerable to this type of trade dispute and also more vulnerable in terms of possible bottlenecks in production, where we rest on our laurels and become too familiar with one specific market, and then we are not really in a reactive position, and sometimes we sit back and rest on our laurels. Therefore, I believe that we need to continue with these measures to resolve this dispute, but at the same time, we can get out of this mess, if you like, by incentivizing the industry to become more dynamic and more creative. There are encouraging signs going in this direction, but there needs to be a far bigger state involvement.
Well, on to committee members. Mr. Williams for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for all our witness here today. This is a very important study. We're talking about the softwood lumber tariffs and its impact on the industry here in Canada. We've had this industry employs about 400,000 people across Canada. So we have some witnesses today from certain provinces that employ quite a few members and stakeholders. And after 9 years and 3 U.S. presidents, the Prime Minister has failed to secure a softwood lumber deal, killing jobs in Canada. And just to give some key stats on that, from Statistics Canada, between 2015 and 2021, Canada's forestry sector experienced a decline of 90,000 jobs, from 300,000 to 210,000 positions, quite possibly the largest decline of any single sector in Canada. And we had the Prime Minister on late night TV about a month ago who said this was just a small issue. Mr. Niquidet, you are representing your province, and can you just tell me if this, A, is a small issue, and B, what has the impact been on jobs in your province since 2015?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, it is as I alluded to, the BC forest sector is very important for the province of British Columbia, so we believe it is a significant issue. The duties have had a sizable impact on the sector, where there's a number of different factors, but the duties have been contributing to lower production and as well as job losses. So we've seen since 2016 over 10,000 jobs lost, and that's just the direct jobs. So there's spin-off effects within communities, the ripple effects that are also happening. So that just multiplies those impacts.
And that's a lot of jobs indirectly, many more. And these are small communities, correct? So a lot of these lumber mills and these direct jobs and indirect are all in smaller communities around BC, is that correct?
Yeah, really the forest sector contributes throughout the province, but even within the Lower Mainland, we find that the sector has a sizable impact. But really, in those rural communities, the forest sector as a percentage of the sort of employment opportunity is just outside, and in some communities, it's far and away the largest contributor to the rural economy.
You mentioned in your opening comments we're going to see next year tariffs doubling. Tell me, or tariffs going up. Tell me about that.
Yeah, we've seen just recently this past year. So every year the Department of Commerce does what's called an administrative review. And so in this last administrative review, we've seen duties move from about 8% to just over 14%. And that was Administrative Review 5. But in terms of our early projections for Administrative Review 6, we're expecting that duties could double again to almost 30%. And so this would take effect in August and will be devastating to the sector. So this is where we feel like there needs to be support for the sector going forward, and certainly getting an agreement with the U.S. a priority.
So how many jobs and how many mills will close if that tariff is doubled?
It's really hard to be precise at this stage because it will depend on the broader market conditions at the time. But certainly, some of our preliminary estimates are that, we could see a reduction of about 20% of the economic activity.
So that's huge. That's a lot of jobs.
Massive.
That's going to be so. What are your members saying? That obviously this is going to have a major impact. Do they feel that the government's made softwood lumber a priority and getting a deal done? I mean, the last Prime Minister got a deal done in 79 days. It's been 9 years. Do you feel this government's made softwood lumber a priority in trade negotiations?
Yes, we've been working with the current government. Minister Ng has done a good job, her and her team, to raise this issue. We need a willing partner in the U.S. to come to the table. And at the end of the day, we do feel like just thinking about past history, when we've actually gotten a deal, it's comes from the highest levels of both governments, so Prime Minister to President. And so we think that after the election is done in the U.S., there's an opportunity to make sure that we're engaging with the new administration and making sure this is a priority.
I'm a little surprised you think it's a good job, but it's been 9 years. Also a little surprised you think we're going to find an easier government no matter who gets in for the election. In terms of other markets, so we depend on the Americans for what percentage of our exports for lumber?
Yeah, for British Columbia, we export about, I'd say, something around 70% of our exports are destined to the U.S. It might be, it's probably higher for Canada as a whole. Just with BC, we're situated on the West Coast and we have that access to some of the Asian markets. So I think the number for Canada as a whole will probably be up over around 85%. So it's our major market, and so we need access to that market. They're the largest consumer of softwood lumber in the world.
Thank you, Mr. Time is up. Mr. Miao for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to both our witnesses for joining us virtually today. And it is an important study we are doing right now. The Canada-U.S. softwood lumber dispute has become one of the most enduring trade disputes between both nations. And over the past 25 years, the United States lumber industry had frequently sought U.S. government restriction on Canadian softwood lumber import through the application of U.S. countervailing duty and anti-dumping laws. What do you suggest would be helpful for a Canadian official in potential negotiation? Can I start with Mr. Nick Coudette?
Yes, thanks for the question. I think the key thing for that we've been stressing is that this really harms the U.S. consumer. Any of these restrictions is driving up the cost of lumber in the U.S. and we have they have a affordability challenge, a housing affordability issue, and so that's very important. I guess the other thing is the duties on deposit. There's over $10 billion worth of duties that have been collected thus far, and they're sitting on deposit. In the past, past agreements, we've used those dollars to grow the market. Softwood lumber is a renewable, sustainable product that if you compare it to other materials, it has a lower carbon footprint, and so there's an opportunity for both sides to use those funds strategically to grow the overall market.
And on that, what do you believe is to be the main challenge in resolving this dispute? And what do you believe an agreement with the U.S. That will benefit Canadian softwood lumber industry should look like?
Well, I think the main barrier has been the U.S. industry. They're looking for restrictions on flows to the U.S. to drive up prices, which benefits them. And so, in any sort of agreement, just the way U.S. trade law is structured, they need to get buy-in from the U.S. industry for any sort of agreement. So, I think that's probably one of the bigger barriers is just getting that U.S. industry to come to the table and sign off on any sort of agreement. I think we have, good sort of precedents in the past and sort of some of the past agreements, looking for a long-term deal. There's different types of border measures that could be applied. And then, as I mentioned before, the use of the deposits that can be, used in a strategic manner. So I think a long-term agreement is good because what we need on both sides of the border is sort of greater certainty around softwood lumber trade, and also the use of the duties to grow the market for softwood lumber, and that's going to, I think, achieve objectives that both parties are interested in.
Thank you. And Monsieur Laplante, do you have anything to add to this?
Well, basically, I think our difficulty with the sector this, and in particular the sawmill sector in the US, is that they are in step with the trade doctrines of the two parties vying for power. There's a great deal of protectionism, and that then works to the advantage of the US industrial sector. So we need to find some voice of conciliation. And we need to suggest to our US counterparts that we should come up with certain agreements that could define reasonable volumes to be protected on both sides of the border. And obviously, all of that presumes that our negotiators are able to get the sector on board and bring them round the table. But for the moment, they're not interested in doing that. The possible use of deposits is probably the most useful one, because we could try and use these deposits to support in a different way our resistance strategy against this dispute and convince companies to sign up to productivity improvement programs.
Thank you.
On to Mr. Savard Tremblay for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses today for your opening remarks. Mr. Laplante, am I correctly summarising what you've said when you've said it's a festival of missed opportunities? Einstein said madness was always repeating the same thing, hoping for different results. But it seems that the US are certainly not mad, but they keep losing their dispute. So it seems that the US are interested in harming our competitiveness and holding up our modernization and put us in a losing position, even if they always lose the legal cases. You've said the Quebec regime, the Quebec system has specifically been drawn up to be in compliance with the free trade agreement. But why is it still not recognized as at this time when we speak, and that the trade dispute settlement mechanism has not really been reworked enough under CUSMA? So as you've said, it's a festival of missed opportunities here. And you've talked about building an industrial strategies at diversification of markets that you're suggesting, or is it a question of investing more in the domestic market? You referred to the construction sector, and a sub-question to that, what are the advantages of going towards increased use of wood rather than concrete? It's an green and ecological material, and the forestry sector, of course, has already brought about important changes going down this path. So could you please give us more details on what you said in your presentation? Thank you very much, Mr. Savard Tremblay. Yes, the Americans know that they're going to lose from a legal point of view, but the stakes are elsewhere. They want to take advantage of these trade disputes so that the Quebec and Canadian industries are on the defensive always. And of course, they're deprived of considerable sums that could be used to improve productivity and modernize equipment. And also, and I think that's the avenue that needs to be further developed, we need to bring the Canadian industries to shift towards other niche products. They need to shift elsewhere. They need to go towards high value-added sectors. Here we've got a significant opportunity, namely the response that we need to bring to the housing crisis, where there will need to be intensification and an increase in construction activities. So if we have a whole gamut of industrial policies that encourage more use of wood as one of the building materials, and if we also at the same time support the industry so that it doesn't just produce commodities and basic products feeding into the beginning of the value chain, then that will give the industry a dynamic push forward. That's what's missing at the moment. Moreover, we need to accompany this effort with the market diversification efforts to be less dependent on the US market. Because this dependence on the US market is what is rendering us more vulnerable, more fragile, especially from an export point of view. There's a great deal of potential that's being underserved because of our dependence on the US market alone. So now we do have an opportunity to seize where we could encourage overall reaction, where we're not just in a wait-and-see position, we're not just sitting it out while we wait for the dispute settlement mechanism to say that we're right once again on the Canadian side. Rather, we need to play a far more active role, a more voluntarist policy, where we explore all the different public policy approaches, and we need to have a global integrated approach organised. We've already done it for the automobile sector. Billions have been ploughed into this sector. We could do the same thing for the forestry sector, subject to the condition that we shouldn't see this industry as solely dependent on export markets. When you refer to diversification, what's happening in other regions of the world? From a geopolitical trade point of view, not everyone can be considered now as a reliable partner respecting international trade rules. So we should turn to which region to explore other possibilities? It's true that there's a shifting sands, and it's difficult to predict how things are going to evolve in the next 20 years. But one thing is certain. On the European side of things, they are also suffering from a great housing crisis. And European economies are also going to need materials to support these efforts that they'll be obliged to undertake as public administrations. So I think that we can have a cautious approach and explore possible collaboration and possible inlets into the European market. That doesn't exclude Asian markets being explored as well. But the Asian markets will be much more complicated because of Chinese trade practices that aim to set up obstacles for other Asian countries who may also be tempted to reduce their dependence on trade with China. One does not exclude the other, but in terms of the weighing of our efforts, we need to, first of all, plough our efforts into the European industries, which are in a good solvent position, and really improve our housing offer.
She's to have to interrupt. Thank you. Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I want to thank the witnesses for being present with us today. I do want to just pick up in some regard to some information that was presented by Monsieur Laplante in his opening testimony. But before I get there, I do want to focus on Mr. Nikia-Day, if you may respond to the following questions. You heard some of the opening testimony by Monsieur Laplante, part of that testimony involving two incredibly important pieces that I wanted to address today in regards to the softwood lumber dispute in the United States. One is the particular situation of productivity today. What is the productivity like within the membership to which you represent, and many of the members there? There's many factors that I'm sure impact productivity in terms of climate, in terms of policy, in terms of even just wages. So what is the productivity like for employees there, and how are workers experiencing that job today?
Yeah, thanks for the question. The sawmills in British Columbia are very advanced. We have utilize some of the best technology in the world, and I think Canadian technology in general for softwood lumber production is known for being very advanced. As a result, we have very highly productive sawmills. And as a result, we're able to pay high wages. These are really good jobs. And if you look at, some of the recent stats that we've done, where sort of average wages in British Columbia were sort of in the 60 to 70,000 range, and we're well up over 100,000. So these are good family supporting jobs throughout the province, and a lot of that has to do with the productivity of the sawmills. That's why they're able to pay those wages.
And thank you so much, Mr. Nikede. That's probably the most important piece to me in this, is making sure that Canadian jobs are protected, Canadian families get what they need so they can put food on the table, they can continue to do the hard work of building up our economy. My concerns, of course, come from the very unique perspective or frame that if we're going to organize in our economy, like Monsieur Laplante suggests, which I agree with, we do need an industrial policy that looks at our inputs, our outputs, particularly for the outputs that help the public good. As policymakers, as people who sit in the House of Commons, our job isn't to make necessarily the bottom line for Canada's corporations, or in some cases the multinational corporations, higher. Our job is to make sure that our economy is working for Canadians. Our economy is working for everyday people. So that's why I asked that question. And this is why I asked the next question. How many of the workers that are present in BC or in any of the membership, the mills that you represent, are unionized?
Yeah, I don't have a specific figure on that. I would say the majority are unionized, mostly with the steel workers. And so, but that can vary. But I would suggest that the majority would be union workers.
Thanks so much, Mr. Nikede. Monsieur Laplante, I wanted to give you a moment to expand on your proposal, a philosophical one I hope to become a manifest reality, which is related to an industrial policy in Canada. Canada, as you are well aware as an economist, is a resource-rich country. Much of our economic output, much of our economic outlook is largely based on raw material production and raw material export, including softwood lumber. You speak to a really important piece of how we can modernize our economy here in Canada, how we can become more competitive in the United States, and albeit all across the globe. And that's by ensuring we have value-added products. This is something, I come from Alberta. I come from an oil-rich province. We talk about this issue a lot. We talk about diversification of our oil. We talk about diversification of our assets. We talk about becoming more relevant and more productive and having bigger paychecks for our workers because of it. Can you speak to the importance of why diversification is important for all of our natural resource sectors, in particular softwood lumber as a means to increase not just wages for workers in Canada, but also our production?
Essentiellement.
Well, basically, it's because we are fabulously wealthy. We have the boreal forest, from which most of our softwood lumber stocks are derived, and we have a very rich ecosystem that produces very high quality fibers. Thanks to all of this, we're able to better exploit this resource and really get the full value from these resources. And it's very important to do this because this forestry resource is threatened by climate change, which is leading to significant disturbances that add to the economic woes with which we're familiar because of the softwood lumber crisis, or in particular because of the ferocious competition coming from our US competitors. And then there's the forest fires that have reduced the forestry activities in several provinces. British Columbia really knows what we're referring to here. And in Quebec, we also had highly devastating forest fires that really threaten the viability of several mills. How can we fight against this threat? We need to shift our efforts, in fact, towards value-added products because we're going to have less timber. So we need to create more value with a more limited resource. And that is a major strategic challenge for companies. Because there's human capital, a very competent labor force, and we have to shelter the labour force from these climate change-related disturbances. And seeking value-added products, therefore, is not just a strictly economic approach, it's also an ecological approach, because we have to deal with an increasingly rare resource.
On to Mr. Martel for 5 minutes, please.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci aux témoins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here with us today. I've got some questions to put, first of all, to Mr. Laplante. Mr. Laplante, I was elected in 2018, and the softwood lumber agreement comes up again and again. I meet with companies, and the forestry sector in Quebec has said that the SLA has to be settled. It's going to be crucial for our companies. We'll never be able to continue living like this. There's something that it's hard for me to seize. When our party was in power, it was sorted out within 99 days. And in the meantime, we've seen 3 U.S. presidents come and go one after the other, and we're not able to reach a settlement at all, it seems. And companies don't talk to me about new niches or things to be created. No, they say, please settle this agreement. Why is it not being settled? So I'd like to hear from you on that aspect. Well, I share your concerns on the concerns of the companies that you've mentioned. I share the same sense of exasperation. But we cannot overlook one particular aspect. No matter how impatient we are, it depends on how the situation evolves in the U.S. And since these 3 presidents have come and gone, the U.S. economy has undergone significant transformative changes. And one of these transformations has been the efforts deployed by the government in Washington and state governments to actually re-industrialize the U.S. In order to do this, they have rolled out major public policy programs, and that has included the fact that they become far more protectionist, for example, the Buy America Act, or if we think about other provisions. Mr. Laplante, well, if we talk about things in these terms today, I respect your point of view. That's interesting as well. But if we hadn't dragged our heels on this agreement, then probably you'd be saying something quite different today, wouldn't you? Well, I wasn't at the bargaining table, but from what I've understood, one of the 2 parties had an advantage in dragging their heels, and I don't think it was Canada. Mr. Laplante, well, time's rushing by. Sorry to interrupt you, but when it comes to job losses in the forestry sector, it's a real cause for concern. There's certain companies that are closing down, and that has a terrible impact on certain communities. If we continue down this same path, what are the long-term effects going to be for workers if things don't evolve and if we remain in this same impasse? The situation really is a great cause for concern. It's very worrying. whichever indicators we look at, there's always one constant. In particular, in Quebec, it may vary also from one province to another, but in Quebec, the forestry industry is in decline. There's a structural decline that we've seen over several decades now, and the forestry sector has not been able to roll out a repositioning strategy. Problems related to the trade agreement are just one of the issues suffered by this industry. It's working in niches where its competitiveness is threatened, amongst others, by the US economy. Just to round off, I think I've got 5 minutes, haven't I? So what is your level of confidence or trust in the capacity of the government to effectively negotiate with the US? What is your level of confidence in the government? Well, I can't really qualify that. However, I do have a fear to share. I fear that the protectionist effort is going to be further intensified in the US, which means that the Canadian negotiators and the Canadian government are going to have to find certain means to set negotiating aims where they'll be able to reach compromises. And that really doesn't seem like an obvious matter to achieve at the moment.
Minutes, please.
Chair. Madam Chair, this is my 10th year as the Member of Parliament. If there's one issue that has never got fully resolved, that continues to be there even today, is this softwood lumber dispute. Mr. LaPlante, you talked quite a bit. You talked about the reforms to have more value-added product, and you suggested the shift to niche, possible niche, to revitalize the industry. You also talked about the need for an industrial policy that will give Canadian firms more share in the Canadian domestic market. And you also talked about incentivizing the industry to make it more dynamic. I will come back to you. If we don't have time, it will be good if you can provide us much more details on the reforms, the industrial policy, and the incentivizing you're talking about, etc. Mr. Nick, quick question. What percentage of your members in British Columbia have foreign ownership?
I think the overwhelming majority are Canadian-based companies with Canadian ownership. You know, we represent small, independent family companies, which would be 100%.
Thank you, Mr. Nick. And with the, tomorrow a new president is going to get elected. Do you see any change in policy depending on who comes to power, whether Donald Trump or Kamala Harris?
Well, we've certainly seen protectionism from both parties, so it's really hard to say. But it's certainly the Trump administration has been more vocal about protectionism, and so. But again, I think under both parties we've seen similar types of policies.
So basically, what you're saying is that irrespective of who becomes the president, this is not going to get resolved soon, and we have to gear up for the new round of dispute, correct?
We need to make it a priority, and we need to be willing to engage and work with either administration.
Yeah. Mr. LaPlante, to come back to you, is there anything specific points you would like to make, whether on the reform side or the need to shift to niche products by the industry, or on the industrial policy you talked about? Is there any particular points you wish to emphasize?
Yes. I'd like to come back in particular to one of the subjects of the dispute, which is particularly sensitive, namely the question of the price of supplies. If we want to truly have a very active policy to push industries towards value-added products and incentivize them to do so, then we need to have the type of royalties that we already impose on other companies in other sectors. So we need to turn around the way that we do things. Fibers are very precious resource, and if it's less processed, it costs more. So if companies want to reduce their price of supplies, then they need to develop niches with higher value added.
Got a very limited time. Whenever the term incentivize or we need to provide incentives, I get concerned because that is asking more taxpayers' dollars to the industry. Already taxpayers have funded quite a bit in this sector. When you say value-added product, I think Quebec is much more, the Quebec-based industry, they are much more adding value to this compared to other parts of Canada. Am I right on that?
Yes, indeed. In several sectors within the industry, there are very promising initiatives underway, for example, with engineered wood and the production of prefab composites related to housing units. That's what we need to go for, because then we can do more with timber that's becoming a more and more rare resource. So my proposal is that as timber is becoming a rare resource, in order for it to bring more money, it needs to be more expensive.
Half minutes.
Oui, Monsieur Laplante, ben écoutez, tout
Yes. Earlier, you were not able to finish off on your point, but I've also got a sub-question to put. The advantage of lumber compared to concrete for future construction projects. Could you comment on that? Well, that's the avenue that really needs to be explored, I think, when it comes to how we can resolve the housing crisis. We have to step up construction, and timber has exceptional qualities because it's got a lower carbon footprint, so that help with construction industries as part of these big construction projects that have to be launched. It won't be completely carbon neutral, but it will certainly have a far lower carbon footprint compared to all of the other possible materials that we could use in order to increase the amount of housing available in Canada. And these fibers are renewable, and they also have potential, enormous potential for diversification. Specialists in forestry no longer talk about the forest as a fiber reservoir, but rather in cutting-edge technology, we see it's a big reservoir of molecules that can be used to actually replace petrochemical products. There can be silo-chemical products, forestry chemical products, which is also a promising avenue to explore. So we need to look at lumber as part of the overall challenges related to sustainable development and the challenge to replace non-renewable products by renewable sources. And Canada and Quebec are well equipped because the boreal forest, even if it has certain vulnerabilities, it remains an extremely solid anchor point for rolling out this new form of economy.
Seconds. Monsieur Desjolins for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you again to the witnesses for being present on this incredibly important study. Listen, Canadians deserve an economy that works for them. That means they need a softwood lumber industry that can help deliver good union jobs, which are good paying jobs, can combat our climate crisis that we're in. Mr. LaPlante's been clear about that, and bring lower prices for Canadians hoping to build a home. These things are paramount to any economy right now. They're paramount to United States economy, they're paramount to most developed Western economies, and they're paramount to Canadians. We're experiencing one of the greatest cost of living crises we've ever seen. And what I've noticed, in particular when it comes to resource development industries, is this great desire to both pursue that next frontier of development for products, which I'm really encouraged for and by, and also this very important need to retool our economy for what challenges Canadians are about to face. Those challenges are the climate crisis. Those challenges are affordability. Those challenges are delivering good paying jobs. How we get there is through an industrial strategy. How we get there is through an industrial policy that incentivizes the good members that Mr. Nicodé represents towards better high input products in an environment created by legislators that will deliver lower cost of goods for Canadians while also building up more good jobs. On the area of the value added and the innovation required on this side of things, I'm very keen to know by Mr. Nicodé what members and your associate members are doing to help diversify the output products of your members, and how are those products giving us, in terms of Canadian softwood lumber industry, an advantage globally, even domestically. I think of a time when Canadians, of course, made things and we produced and invented stuff and we produced them all over the world for everyone. What kind of innovation is on the horizon for Canadian softwood lumber?
I'm sorry, a short answer if possible, sir.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we're already producing a diverse array of products, and some of it depends on the species. BC has a number of different species, which is an advantage. One thing that is, I think, has a lot of potential is mass timber, and there's certainly, if we're wanting to build into multi-story homes, into bigger structures, then mass timber would be the way to go. And certainly that can mean that we're producing it ourselves, and some of our members are starting to do that, but also being the supplier to those mass timber producers.
Thank you very much.
They need lumber to produce that.
Thank you very much. For our witnesses, the members are timed, and it's difficult to interrupt, and I'm sorry, but if I don't interrupt, we're taking somebody else, one other member's time. So, okay, Mr. Zimmer for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's good to be at committee. After 9 years and three U.S. presidents, Trudeau and the Liberals have failed to get a deal with the Americans on softwood lumber. We, under our former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, got a deal done within 80 days of becoming a government and him becoming Prime Minister. This from a mill manager in northeastern BC who wishes to remain anonymous. Quote, "The main reasons mills have had to close are political decisions. The trees are still there to support a vibrant, sustainable forest industry. However, access to those trees has been heavily restricted. The combined impact of these political decisions is estimated to have reduced the area available for harvesting by 50%. And based on where these areas are located, the impact on the annual allowable cut will be greater than 50%. This is enough of an impact to cause the closure of 2 of 5 mills in the piece, in my riding, costing the area $100 million annually. And that is just logging and hauling. That's a very limited part of what forestry impacts in my community. And some may have heard of the Prime Minister's goals of 30 by 30 and 50 by 50, and this effect that it will have with such a radical policy, especially on forestry. My question to you, Mr. Nicodé, will there be any forestry jobs left in northeastern BC if the federal and provincial government's restrictions and closures are fully implemented?
Well, we certainly hope so. I think, what you're referring to there is also provincial policies. And so, that's something we've been very vocal about the need for a working forest within British Columbia. We certainly support the protection of biodiversity, but there needs to be a balance. And we need to have a land base that is designated for timber production to support jobs and communities.
Well, I think, Mr. Nicodé, too, the question around proper forest management, we've seen forest fires in my community as well. And often what I've heard from folks that actually are loggers in the areas is that these areas have often been left untouched, so it's not even being properly managed, and all it does is burn. We've been affected by spruce kill and pine beetle kill as well, and instead of actually harvesting that wood, it's just left there to rot and eventually burn. My second question, again from Mr. Nikiday. The Prime Minister dismissed his failures on softwood lumber as a small issue, and you might have seen it on a New York talk show where he referred to forestry and softwood lumber as a quote, small issue. Just weeks after, the U.S. slapped Canada with a 14.5% tariff on softwood, nearly doubling it overnight. Since the announcement, 2 mills in BC have closed. Another mill in my community was lost after that, putting nearly 500 workers out of a job. And the economic impacts are beyond 100 million, as you just heard in my question earlier. After 9 years and 3 U.S. presidents, Trudeau and the Liberals have failed to get a deal with the Americans on softwood lumber. Again, we got it done within 80 days, and I hear my colleagues across the way, they throw up their hands about, it's up to the U.S. government to come up with a decision. Well, we got it done within 80 days. Your Prime Minister who came in 2015, Obama was current president then. There was big fanfare that the agreement was going to get done in Ottawa, and simply the president left and no agreement was signed. but more of a simple question, Kurt, because I think the small issue reference is offensive to a lot of us, where forestry is really the backbone of the British Columbia economy. The simple question, do you think the Prime Minister's failure on softwood lumber is, quote, a small issue?
I'm sorry, gentlemen, and I know Bob would like it, but, you have to watch the clock. It was only 4 minutes, so my apologies. Mr. Sidhu, 4 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for being here on this very important study. Of course, our government values the lumber industry and the workers, and will continue to support that industry. Our government has been very mindful in its deliberations when it comes to any trade negotiations. Our priority is to secure a good deal for Canadian industries and workers. I know the Conservative approach is to do a deal no matter what, and don't worry about the workers, just get a deal done. My question to the witnesses here would be, would you agree that a good deal is better than a fast deal? And what would constitute a good deal in your opinion? Maybe we can start with Mr. Nikiday.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I mean, we need to be careful that we're not, we do want to make sure that the terms are fair for Canada. And, part of that is getting a long-term deal and making sure that we have, access to a sizable portion of the U.S. market share consistent with what we have historically. So I think those are two key components. I think it is important to make this a priority and to push for a deal. But yes, I mean we don't want to sign on to just anything. It has to be a good deal for Canada.
And perhaps any of the witnesses that want to participate in this question? No, that's okay. Well, we know that Canada has long.
Yes, I agree with Mr. Nikiday. We need to have an agreement that's fair and equitable to support the development and prosperity of Canadians. And this agreement also has to be favourable for industries with potential who want to further develop. So, given that, we shouldn't just get an agreement at any cost. No, we need to have an agreement that gives priority to increased prosperity with fairer tariffs and more flexibility and more autonomy so that companies are able to develop further using the export markets.
Madam Chair, how much time do I have left? 1 minute? Okay, so I'll be really quick with this one. As we know, Canada has many long-standing trade agreements, CUSMA, CPTPP, CETA, that's giving us preferential market access in the Indo-Pacific and ASEAN markets. Besides the North American market, which markets do you believe holds the biggest potential for industry? We've heard that the Quebec government will be reaching out to the European market, as right now they're doing roughly over $300 million in trade, in lumber trade, and they're looking at some of the European markets with the access that we've gotten through the CETA agreements. Maybe to both of our witnesses here today, is there potential markets that your industry is looking at where you can see the biggest potential?
Yeah, I can start. We've always had long-standing relationships with different places in the Asia-Pacific region. Certainly Japan. There's long-standing relationships, and really, in terms of high-value products, they've been a source of demand. And throughout China's also been a significant place for our products. There's been a lot of competition with Russia, but then certainly, throughout South Korea, India, these are all places throughout the Indo-Pacific region, I think has potential over the longer term.
Thank you very much. Time is up. Thank you very much to our witnesses. I will suspend momentarily for our other witnesses to come on screen. We have with us on this panel J.D. Irving Limited, Jerome Pelletier, Vice President Sawmills and Chair of the New Brunswick Lumber Producers. Welcome, Mr. Pelletier. And from W&M Enterprises by video conference, Wayne Harder. Welcome to you both. Mr. Pelletier, we'll give the floor to you for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the committee for allowing me to be here today. I represent J.D. Irving Limited, but also I'm the co-chair of the New Brunswick Lumber Producers. The New Brunswick Lumber Producers represent 95% of the softwood lumber production in New Brunswick. We're a key part of the New Brunswick forest products value chain. We're the largest roundwood buyers for the local private woodlot owners. We're supporting thousands of employees working in the mills, but also professional loggers, truckers, silviculture workers in all regions of the province. The NBLP, or the New Brunswick Lumber Producers, are the largest supplier of wood chips, biomass, and sawdust, which are key ingredients in the manufacturing of the New Brunswick pulp and paper industry, as well as pellet products. We also supply products to wood fencing manufacturing facilities, as well as pellet manufacturing operations. There are currently 40,000 registered private and industrial woodlot owners in New Brunswick. Historically, the Government of New Brunswick Timber Utilization Survey reports that approximately 50% of the sawmill wood supply comes from private land. This makes New Brunswick the only province with Nova Scotia where such a large volume of logs come from private sources. This is the primary reason why New Brunswick was, until 2017, excluded from the previous 4 lumber trade cases. In 2021, New Brunswick's forest product sector generated the highest provincial GDP per capita in Canada, which was 56% more than the next closest province. In 2021, the New Brunswick forest product sector directly employed almost 12,000 employees. When you add in indirect and induced employment, there are over 23,000 employees people working in the province in the forest product sectors, which is 1 in every 18 people in New Brunswick workforce. The impact of the duty imposed on the New Brunswick lumber producers significantly reduce our capacity to compete with other producers located in the northeast of the United States, Scandinavia, and Europe. It also limits our ability to further invest capital in our operations, again reducing our long-term overall competitiveness. It is interesting to note that since 2017, the Canadian lumber industry lost almost 10% of the U.S. market share, while the EU producers gained 5% during the same period of time. As part of the trade dispute resolution process under NAFTA and CUSMA, several appeals have been filed by the New Brunswick lumber producers and other Canadian lumber companies. Although NAFTA and CUSMA direct that a final panel decision be made in less than 1 year, after more than 5 years, no decision has been made. The delay has in part led to the enormous cash deposits held by the U.S. Treasury. Our view is that NAFTA and the CUSMA legal process is broken and ineffective, which lead us to believe that a negotiated settlement is the only way that we will resolve this trade case. Based on the West Fraser and Canfor shareholders' latest annual reports, as mandatory respondents for the CVD and AD administrative reviews, the toll duty rate to be imposed by the U.S. Department of Commerce in August 2025 is now forecasted to be over 30%. Today, the Canadian industry is paying 14% combined duty, and in 2023, the industry paid 8% combined duty. So next year's forecasted duty is quite significant. If such duty is implemented, it will have significant impact on the Canadian production. We expect to see many curtailments that will take place all over the country, and that will impact mill workers, but also loggers, truckers, pulp and paper mills, renewable energy manufacturing plants, mass timber and engineered wood manufacturing facilities. It will also impact the railroad companies and port activities. Minister Ng has been active with the Canadian industry on developing a framework for the next softwood lumber agreement. The New Brunswick lumber producers appreciates all the efforts and focus that Minister Ng has dedicated to this important file. Unfortunately, the Canadian industry is not always aligned on the negotiation strategy that Canada should adopt to resolve the current trade case. We are concerned that a small group of Canadian lumber companies may not want to resolve the current trade case in a timely manner. We believe it is important for the Government of Canada to lead a path forward to a settlement that will be accepted, maybe not by all, but by the majority of the Canadian lumber producers. It is important for the survival of our industry. The current lumber trade case between Canada and U.S. is the fifth one in the last 40 years. In the past four trade cases, the softwood lumber dispute was resolved only when both the Canadian and the U.S. governments made it a priority. For that reason, the New Brunswick lumber producers respectfully ask the Government of Canada, led by Minister Ng, but also by our Prime Minister, to work jointly with all parties of each province, lumber associations and lumber producers to develop a negotiation strategy, and following the U.S. election to encourage the United States Trade Representative to enter in a serious negotiation to resolve this long-term issues.
Thank you, Mr. Pelletier. Sorry to interrupt. The committee members have many questions. Mr. Harder, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Here. What's that?
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Harder.
Sorry. So I've been a contractor for 32 years, 38 years in the industry. The effects of the shutdowns, we have 90% job loss in this area alone. The businesses in the area have that I've spoken to have anywhere from 10 to 25% losses due to people just not spending money. So it's pretty significant in our area. Provincial legislation has definitely been a big problem. The tariffs is just a straw on the camel's back, so to speak, for it's just unsustainable at this point. And I think the lack of someone mentioned earlier fires. We've had some of the largest forest fires in BC here, and have been able to harvest almost none of them due to permitting and just unwillingness of the government to do anything. So the just consistent what seems to us as unimportant for any politician to try to make anything happen going forward. I think that's all I got to say.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Harder. I will open up the floor for questions. Mr. Simmer, for 6 minutes.
Yeah, thank you again. And my questions will be for Wayne Harder. After 9 years and 3 U.S. presidents, Trudeau and the Liberals have failed to get a deal with the Americans on softwood lumber. Harper and us Conservatives got a deal within 80 days of becoming government and him Prime Minister. While we see the current Prime Minister on a New York talk show dismissing his failures on softwood lumber as a, quote, small issue, and I'm sure you've seen that, Wayne. You and your wife, Marie, have worked hard for the last 32 years and up to 38 years, I guess, just working in the industry, and have a business that employed hundreds of people and contributed millions to our local economy. You have employed countless apprentices, summer students, young people who are starting out life, giving them a job, and in many cases, eventually giving them lifelong careers. My first question of 3, how devastating has this softwood lumber failure been for you, your business, and other businesses?
Oh, well, very significant. Like I said, 90% job loss in my business alone. And when I talked to the other contractors around, we were all kind of, the percentages were very similar. everybody employs a different amount of people, so but the percentage number stays the same. So
maybe put a value, Wayne, to your company before the closures happened, you know, because we knew how many people you employed. You're a big employer in Fort St. John. Your value of your business then and now, what has been that difference? Can you say that?
Oh, yeah. So from 2016 would have been the kind of the high that was shortly after the tariffs were settled. We had a few years that were good until 2018. So from then we had a downslide of 25%, just steadily down, and then up until the last was the final 90% that cut off. You're asking dollars and cents?
Yeah. What's a dollar amount in the millions?
Well, from the peak it would be 30 million.
Million.
30 million. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, I'll get to my next question, Wayne. I know time is short here. In the last 9 years, you know better than most that we've lost 24 mills in BC alone. They have been in government for 9 years and still no softwood lumber, contrasted with us who got it done within the first 80 days. The radical Prime Minister and the radical Environment Minister and their close friend in BC, Premier Eby, I think should be ashamed of themselves for the damage they have caused you and thousands of BC forestry families like you. This is a personal question, but if the Prime Minister and his radical friends were sitting here in front of you, if you were asked to fire anyone for incompetence, who would you fire in this NDP Liberal government?
Oh, all of them. Yeah. No,
Well, that's a simple answer to that question. My last question, Wayne. Actually, maybe I'll slip in another one there. NDP Liberal government and their provincial counterpart have done a very poor job in terms of forest management. You talked about the forest fires. I've seen you in action, really trying to mitigate some of the damage, some of the trees that have been down, trying to do forest breaks and things like that, trying to preserve that fiber and the trees. We have seen an increase in forest fires, but we've also heard on the ground this government and their provincial counterparts' lack of action on forest management, really forest mismanagement. And, again, the loss of timber has been incredible. Third question, if people aren't logging and harvesting the wood, what do you think will happen with the loss of that good forest management which harvesting and logging provides? Because we know that an active forest is a healthy forest. What happens if all of a sudden there's no forestry? Is the forest healthy?
Well, not at all, actually. The forestry consultants out here, we do fire training every year for our guys, and they've been telling them for the past 20 years that Donnie Creek fire, that they needed to log areas in there for fire breaks and better firefighting access to fires slow down in regen areas versus old decadent wood.
Right.
So then that was ignored for a very long time by a provincial government, which ended up being a large contributor to this 620,000 hectare fire.
Yeah.
Never mind the Red Creek and Stoddard Creek fires, which were on top of that as well.
So it's just more trees are going to burn, in other words. And maybe that brings me to my last question, because I think, I've heard from you, there's this question that gets often, it lands in places like Toronto and Vancouver that you'd think there's no trees left in northern BC to harvest. And that's why all these closures have been happening. Like a 50% loss in the annual allowable cut is incredible. That's half. And we used to have this vibrant forestry sector in the province. It was our best sector, best performing sector. But maybe just a super simple question for everybody out there. Do we have sufficient trees in northeastern BC to continue to grow forestry in BC? Because I think with this retraction, there's a huge opportunity for this to grow. And even just in the trees that have burned, they're still harvestable. Maybe speak, Wayne, to the question, do we have sufficient trees in northeastern BC to continue to grow forestry in BC?
Absolutely. I think those studies have been done. They had enough sustainable forest for 4 mills, I do believe, it'd be 4 mills. We only have 2 left now that are running, and one of which in town here doesn't even have a light license to cut. You can't get a license to cut. So that's all done on private land base, which doesn't get regened. It turns into fields after.
Right.
Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Ms.
Wayne.
Carter. On to Mr. Sidhu for 6 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for taking the time to be with us here today. We've heard about Canadian lumber being used to construct homes here in Canada, and what I hear from my constituents is we need to build homes faster. And with our Housing Accelerator Fund, we've invested over $4 billion through municipalities to help cut red tape so houses can be built faster by developers and, of course, municipalities. We've heard from the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Pierre Poilievre, saying he's going to cut this fund, and now we're hearing directly from municipalities that are going to be impacted. Municipalities, cities like Brampton, the Housing Accelerator Fund in Brampton will help build over 25,000 homes. In Surrey, Saskatoon, Guelph, here in Ottawa, we're hearing from the municipalities that this will hurt home building. And coming back to the lumber industry here in Canada, the Housing Accelerator Fund is going to fast track roughly 750,000 homes. And we've never, I think when we focus on the lumber industry here in Canada, we need to support them with local home building as well. And I'd like to hear from our witnesses in terms of local demand from the housing industry and how this would help them with some of the industry issues that we're having and supporting workers here in Canada. Maybe we can start with Mr. Pelletier.
Thank you very much. That's a good and interesting question. 750,000 homes built would represent roughly half of what's being built in the United States in an entire year. So it's a very significant volume. I'm convinced that the fiber, the material, the lumber is available here in Canada to be supplied to build those homes. And there are no roadblocks, I guess, that I could say that would prevent us from doing it with Canadian lumber.
Okay. Well, it's good to hear. I mean, 750,000 is no small number, as you just said, and I think constituents in my riding and across Canada expect us to support industry, support municipalities as we build those homes. So it's unfortunate that Mr. Pierre Poilievre has already said he's going to cancel that very important program. Coming back to lumber, I wanted to ask you about the trade agreements that we have, whether it's the CPTPP, CETA, CUSMA, giving us access to the Indo-Pacific region. Have you thought about growing into that market? What are your thoughts? What are you hearing from stakeholders in the industry about opportunities in the Indo-Pacific region?
In the Pacific region, we're located in eastern Canada and in the state of Maine. So for us, it's
Europe.
It's outside our historical markets. Having said that, there are opportunities to sell lumber overseas, but it always comes at a cost, at a premium of transportation. I think we should be more focused on growing market here in Canada or in North America to avoid that extra transportation components.
Yeah. And when you talk about the local market here, where are you seeing lumber products come in from? What other countries are you seeing that they're trying to come into the Canadian market?
There's a little bit of European lumber coming into the Canadian market. Most of the imports in North America are going into the United States. We see some volume also coming from South America, but they are still fairly small compared to our domestic production.
And I've had the opportunity to ask the previous panel, look, our government's focused on the lumber industry. We want to make sure we get a good deal rather than a fast deal. What does a good deal look like to you?
I think a good deal would allow for predictability. Today, the duty rates will move as much as 100% year over year. So we'd like to have a long-term agreement, 10 years plus. We'd like the agreement to be predictable. We'd like to have access to a fair portion of the U.S. market. And we mentioned the cash deposits. There's over $10 billion today. So we'd like to as an industry, be able to recover some of those cash deposits, understanding that we'll have to share it with most likely the U.S. Companies or the U.S. coalition. Also, I think we need to consider using some of those cash deposits to grow the market, to allow us to invest more in research and development for mass timber, for example. Yeah, we should keep that in mind.
And we're seeing that as an innovative technique to build more homes, is using mass timber. My last question before my time's up is the stakeholders in the U.S., what kind of weight do they hold with the government down there? Is there roadblocks that's stopping an agreement to take place from the U.S. government perspective?
Well, I'm not a trade laws expert, but my understanding is the U.S. Lumber Coalition, which filed a petition against the Canadian industry, they have a veto on any agreement.
Oh, okay.
So it's important to work with them to ensure that they are comfortable with
So even if the U.S. government wanted to do a deal, the industry down there has a veto. Is kind of what.
Don't quote me on that.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci à nous.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. Thank you for your presentations. Obviously, in the first half of this meeting and currently, we've heard about midterm and long-term solutions, ideas for conversion within the industry, possible approaches to establish an industrial policy. But in the short term, we've got this difficult situation in the sector, and we know that the sums that are unjustly retained are going to be damaging for the companies because they are deprived of cash liquidity that they should be able to enjoy. So I've got a question to both the witnesses. Should the government actually give a loan and guaranteed loan program equivalent to the sums that are being held in the US so that our companies would be able to get through this crisis? I think that programs to help Canadian companies because of duties going up to 30%, I think would be favourable for certain companies. I think we have to be vigilant nevertheless, because if these are programs that are not economically justifiable, then once again they'll be seen as direct subsidies to companies, and possibly that could just bump up the countervailing duties in the long term. And Mr. Harder, what do you think about that possible program for loans?
There's opportunity, but I would have to agree that it would look like subsidies, and I don't think long term that it would be a big help. Short term, it would help people bridge over until the markets come back or mills start up, so that people don't sell into a depressed market, their livelihood, which they'll mostly lose.
We've also heard in the first panel, and it's interesting because you're industry representatives, but in the first part of this meeting, we heard from the Institut de Recherche en Économie Contemporaine, who said perhaps there needs to be a bigger industrial policy instead of just saying let's get out of the crisis and get rid of the duties, even if we want to get rid of these tariffs. But should we not also have an increased use of commodities within the domestic market and diversify exports so that it's not just aimed at the US market, perhaps also the European market? Do you think these are useful approaches? Yes, that's an excellent question. Engineered wood, such as laminate composite, is the only 100% renewable construction product, and the Canadian Building Code today allows for apartments to be built to 12 stories only with wood. So if you look around Ottawa today and see how many 12-story buildings are built with wood, there's basically none. We still use concrete and steel in general, and they're the ecological footprint is extremely negative compared to taking a tree which might actually burn down and use it in a building where it can last for the next 300 years. So there are opportunities to really boost the consumption of this type of wood product in our construction industry. Now that seems logical. Perhaps you'd like to react, Mr. Harder, but it does seem that a big part of this timber where there's tariff imposed on the US, where we could take it away from the US market, and that would calm down the trade war, and we should use it here in Canada. Is that what you're saying? Or in an ideal world, we would still have access to the US market, would also allow the Canadian market to better flourish in this sector. Mr. Harder, do you have any answer on this?
No, not really, no.
Pas de réponse là-dessus. Donc.
No response on that. And on the idea of diversification, Mr. Pelletier, market diversification, are we putting too many eggs in the same basket, just working with one sole partner? The US, of course, has always been a big trade partner. We've had relations with clients there over 4 or 5 decades already. Diversifying our market is, of course, always appropriate. But I think that the US market should remain an active market for Canadian producers. Once again, question for both of you. The last tariffs were stepped up in November 23. There was an announcement about extra tariffs in Washington, and it was before the mandate letters were sent out by the Prime Minister. And in the mandate letter for the International Trade Minister, it doesn't mention softwood lumber at all. Is that reassuring for you? No is the answer. Mr. Harder, what do you think?
No, like we have no settlement, so.
Maintenant, dans le rapport de l'étude.
Now, in the report of the study, 30 seconds. So in report with this study that we did in November 2023, there was a recommendation the Canadian government should have a special envoy for softwood lumber to have a dialogue with US counterparts to support Canada's efforts so that there could be a negotiation to resolve this trade dispute on softwood lumber. As far as I know, it hasn't been done. Do you think it would be very good to have this type of appointment of an envoy? Do you think that would be going in the right direction? Should we put more pressure to get that type of nomination? I imagine it'll just be a yes or no that you'll be able to slip in. Yes, the producers of New Brunswick did support that approach launched last year. Mr. Harder?
No comment.
Got no response. Okay, Mr. Desjardins, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being present with us in the study. Of course, the biggest issue we're studying right now is the fact that we're suffering tariffs on softwood imports to the United States. That being the most severe issue related to this study, it's some matter of concern to me, and I think Canadians right across the country, of the 3 major impacts that this tariff has. 1, on producers. Those who produce are paying higher costs to be able to compete against their like products in the United States market. 2, affordability is suffering in Canada, partly because of it. And finally, we're having no end in sight to the very unlikely and very uncertain situation that is ahead of us pending the American election, of course. Mr. Pelletier, it's clear that since the 2017 Trump administration's imposition of new tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber, that these are some of the very highest tariffs we've ever seen by conservatives just south of the border to us to impose on Canadian industries. In 2017, we've seen the Trump administration make very clear that they were going to impose this ever since the ending of the agreement we had in 2015. How did the industry prepare prior to the, of course, 2017 American conservative movement to ban Canadian goods, in particular goods like softwood lumber? How did the industry prepare for that in 2017, knowing that the agreement expired in 2015?
There were several meetings that took place amongst industry leaders. Some of them were chaired by the Minister of Global Affairs at the time, Minister Freeland, and there were a lot of discussions on how How do we prepare for the trade case? What are the legal levers that could be used to defend and explain the Canadian position? And how do we also be prepared to answer some of the questions that we knew the U.S. Department of Commerce was going to be asked?
Maybe just on that point, Mr. Pelche, and I'm very glad you brought that up. Conservatives in the United States have argued at that time when they imposed this historically large tariff, they argued that it was because Canadian companies were largely benefiting from quote unquote subsidized land. Do you want to explain what that argument means for Canadians here at home and why that argument is not valid for American large softwood lumber producers as an argument to impose tariffs brought on by American conservatives?
Yeah, I think the view south of the border is that some of the Canadian lumber producers, especially from British Columbia, Alberta, Quebec, and Ontario, are benefiting from a guaranteed supply from Crown land, and I think that's the perception from the U.S. Lumber Coalition.
And there was a report commissioned to investigate the reality of that impact to our economy. Do you know the outcome of that in terms of how much subsidy, quote unquote, that land tenureship was providing these companies? How much percentage?
Unfortunately, I don't have that information with me today. I'm sorry.
Very fortunate. Don't worry, Mr. Pelche, I do. Less than 1%. So conservatives in the United States tried to protect their industry by saying that Canadian companies were enjoying a subsidy because the land that they're getting timber from is publicly owned Crown land. That's the argument our American counterparts are using. They're staying consistent on that. They're continuing to increase the tariff, though. This is the problem. Do you think land and the Crown land increases its subsidy?
I don't think so. We operate mills in New Brunswick. I can't really judge for the other jurisdictions in Canada, but for New Brunswick, I know Crown land is not a subsidy.
Exactly, and that's the thing that we need our Canadian government to pursue clarity on immediately. But I think to your point, you're speaking about a settlement agreement. I wanted to see clarity in your opening testimony about your proposal and a fixation on the reality of a settlement agreement. Is this a settlement agreement in regards to the most recent August 8th, the lawsuits initiated by the government as it relates to the August 8th announcement, or a prior settlement agreement?
I'm sorry, I don't recall the August. Are you referring to the duties announced?
Which settlement are you looking, or what kind of legal?
I refer to a settlement or a long-term agreement. That's what I refer to.
I understand. Okay. Thank you very much. In terms of aspects of CUSMA, this is an area that is coming up to this committee's review here soon. It's an important operating agreement. As you know, conservative to the south of us forced Canada and Mexico into an agreement. That's not necessarily beneficial for our industries here, but of course American conservative interests are often very heavily weighted in North America and often have a paramountcy across our economy. How do you recommend we amend CUSMA to ensure Canadian businesses, Canadian owners, can combat American conservative tariffs?
Well, we are concerned with the appeal process in CUSMA. As I mentioned or alluded earlier, CUSMA direct for 1 year, 1 year for the panel to rule on any appeal process, and we're 5 years out. So I think there's a desire, not a desire, but there's a need here to be more prescriptive on how panels will be appointed and how they will function and how they will deliver their rulings.
Thank you very much. I'm
Mr. Pelche.
sorry, your time is up. On to Mr. Baldinelli for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Harder and Mr. Pelche, for being here. It's an important study for a sector that employs over 400,000 Canadians. And today, through your comments, you get a real sense of the frustration of business owners, communities, and workers who have been, impacted by, I would say, government inaction to reach a resolution on softwood lumber duties. I mean, it's been 9 years, 3 U.S. presidents. And this government's unable to resolve the situation. Meanwhile, we had a previous government that did it in 79 days. I mean, this inaction has cost the sector about $9 to $10 billion in U.S. imposed tariffs. And in August, the U.S. is going to increase those tariffs and announced that it's going to increase those tariffs to 14% from the current 8%. The minister at the time, our Minister of International Trade, said it was disappointing. And then to see the Prime Minister on U.S. television then claiming it's a small issue. I'm not going to suggest it's disappointing. I'm going to say it's devastating for those companies, but more importantly, for those workers in the communities they live in. In September, just following that announcement of the duties being increased, Canfor in BC announced the closure of mills in Vanderhoof and Fort St. John. That's 500 jobs. Statistic Canada shows that 90,000 jobs have been lost in the sector since 1990. That's 40,000 in British Columbia alone. 24 mills have closed in BC since 2016. So I'm going to start with you, Mr. Harder, first. I mean, what has been the impact on these communities and workers in your area because of this failure of the government?
Oh, very significant. Actually, the 500 jobs would only include Chetwynd North, wouldn't even include Vanderhoof. That would be even more than that. We've had farmers, because a lot of loggers are farmers here as well, and we've had them come up to us saying that they're not sure how they're going to be able to sustain farming because they rely on that off-farm income to help them sustain that, so that the ripple effect is going to be very, very large.
Not to mention just the merchants in the area. I mean, we're talking communities of about, 4,500 and 21,000? I mean, what is the economic spinoff and pain that's also being caused?
So the people I talk to, the merchants, and they're telling us the lowest number I've heard was 10%, but most people are in that 20 to 25% reduction in sales due to the mill shutdown in town.
What's particularly frustrating is back in November, I mean, this committee tabled its 12th report, and it was called Anti-Dumping and Countervailing Duties Being Applied on Certain Canadian Softwood Lumber Products. It contained 7 recommendations, and the government agreed to all 7. The first recommendation even included this passage. It says, the government will continue to engage the United States to accelerate the pace of impartial dispute settlement processes with the ultimate objective of resolving the softwood lumber dispute. What struck me were the words accelerate the pace. I mean, it's been 9 years now. And what is the government waiting for? I mean, my colleague had mentioned that it's not even in our international trade minister's mandate letter to resolve this dispute. But how do you accelerate the pace when you have a government in office that thinks this is simply a small issue? Mr. Harder, I'll start with you.
Well, obviously they didn't see it a very big priority because it's a little hard to negotiate if you wait till the last possible second to engage.
Okay, I mean, there must be a sense of frustration on your part in what you're seeing out in Eastern Canada with regards to the lack of a resolution or dispute settlement in this area.
Yeah, it's very concerning. It's concerning for us at Irving, concerning for our members at the New Brunswick Lumber Producers, concerning for also all the rural communities. We have companies operating in 70% of rural communities in New Brunswick. So the level of anxiety is higher now that we're paying 14% duty, and people know that 30% is coming soon. So we need to act. We need to engage the United States in a meaningful negotiation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sheehan for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the testimony from our witnesses. I'm from Sault Ste. Marie, and located in Northern Ontario, which is 90% of the landmass of all of Ontario, with about 8% of the population. And there's quite a bit of forestry going on throughout Northern Ontario. And I was picking up on Mr. Pelche's testimony about the differences between the provinces. There are a lot of Pelches up in Dubreuilville and Sault Ste. Marie, and just for the record. Yeah, they're very good people. And I had a roommate from Dalhousie, New Brunswick, and his family worked in the forest industry, and we used to have quite a few chats about the differences. His name was Ferlac, and his dad used to travel across the country as kind of a consultant. And one of the things that, we need to recognize is that this has been going on for 30 years, this softwood lumber dispute. There's been nine prime ministers. And I appreciated what your remark when you said the lumber barons have a veto, and they are very powerful. How important is Mr. Pelche? Because, in talking with, my former roommate and people in the industry about how the Americans continue to still buy our lumber because of the demand. They can't produce enough in the United States, in particular with all these disasters that are happening in the United States through climate change. They're destroying homes at a record pace, and they're rebuilding them, so they have to buy them. And one of the things that I found effective, because I come from a steel town, Algoma Steel, and we went down to the United States, and we made sure that they understood that what these tariffs are, what these duties are really a tax on the American people, because they're still buying our wood, because we have great wood. We produce it excellently. We have great transportation networks that can get them down there reliably. Mr. Pelche, what would you say? Would you agree with that terminology, that this is really a tax on the American people to purchase our wood at the end? Because they're in an acute housing crisis, like an acute housing crisis, and then along comes these climate disasters, and it's creating that demand. How should we go about getting that message into the United States?
Well, there are different organizations in the United States that are taking costs of building materials very seriously. The Association of Homeowners, for example, or of the retailers. They've lobbied in the past. They've sent letters to the Capitol Hill to raise this issue of on lumber duties and possibly reducing access to lumber from Canada or other jurisdictions.
Okay, so I guess through you to the witnesses, would it make sense that this trade committee actually go down there after the election, in particular because there are some people who are talking about increasing these tariffs across the board by 10%. And first of all, I'd like to ask, what would a 10% increase look like for the forest industry in New Brunswick if that were to happen?
Well, a 10% increase would be devastating for the New Brunswick industry. I would expect a lot of our operations would curtail, and because we're highly integrated with other forest product sectors, the impact of sawmills going down would have also an impact on tissue mills, paper mills, wood pellet operations.
Thank you.
And to answer your question on lobbying in the United States with different organizations, I don't see any, I wouldn't have any concerns with that approach.
Okay, thank you. Duly noted. The one of the places up in Northern Ontario, White River, reopened. It actually shut down when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, but it recently reopened, and it reopened with a partnership with the First Nations in the area, the Anishinaabe. How important do you think it is for the forest sector to work with Canada's Indigenous peoples in managing and growing the forest industry?
I think it's very important to work with our First Nations. Today, I can't envision a system where they're not consulted when we're operating on Crown land, it would be. It'd be probably beneficial to have them at the table also when we talk about trade case and how impactful it is to our industry.
Thank you. And just
you have 10 seconds.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2 minutes, please.
Parfait. Merci. Bien, parlons-en justement de cette...
Thank you. Let's talk about the fact that this agreement has not been reached. I quite agree with my Conservative colleagues that it really doesn't make sense that we haven't reached this agreement. But I do understand that sometimes it's better not to have an agreement than having a bad agreement, because if we're the losers in this agreement, then we're not going to win much. So I'm putting something to both witnesses. How come there's still no agreement? Is this the best solution, the best lasting solution, i.e. to get an agreement? Well, if I've correctly understood the question, how can we explain the fact that there's still no agreement? Well, it's because there haven't been any negotiations. Yes, we have to start by negotiating. Yes, that is a good explanation. What would be your response, Mr. Harder?
As I said earlier, the same thing. There's been no negotiations. There's been no engagement until the last possible second, and you don't negotiate with a strong negotiator on the 11th hour. You start a little bit earlier than that.
You have 40 seconds.
OK, parfait. Si j'ai encore 40 secondes.
Okay, so if we've still got 40 seconds, so let's push this further. An agreement, but not at any cost. If we're talking about an ideal agreement, and then we talk about a realistic agreement, and then we talk about an agreement that we really want to avoid, what would that all look like? I think a realistic agreement would be an agreement where Canadian producers still have reasonable access to the US market, and an agreement where we could get back a significant amount of our deposits.
Mr. Desjardins, for 2 minutes. I'm trying to get the other members to have an opportunity, please. So 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Pelchat, in 2017, when the Trump administration imposed tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber, they were as high as 24% for some companies. What was the percentage Irving paid?
I'm just going off memory, but I believe we were around 8 or 9%.
I believe it was according to a CBC article CBC article, which noted that it was 3%. Does that seem more accurate?
3% was only for the countervailing duty portion of our duty, and you have to add the anti-dumping, which we paid the what we call the all others rate, which was the Canadian average. So I think it was 3 plus 6 for a total of 9 or close to 9%.
Why is it that some of your domestic competitors paid up to 24%?
At the time, if I recall, the respondent for countervailing duty were Irving, Resolute, Canfor, West Fraser, and I believe Tolko.
So the biggest company.
The biggest, and Irving, we were a voluntary respondent, which means that we were the only Canadian company at the time that wanted to be voluntarily examined by the U.S. Department of Commerce. That's why we receive our own rate. But the weighted average rate for all those 5 companies was much higher than us, because we effectively demonstrated that the level of subsidies in New Brunswick is almost null.
Is negligible.
Okay.
And so
I'm
that's
sorry,
that's a tactic
Mr.
that I think-
Desjardins, you've got 15 seconds remaining.
Well, thank you very much, and Chair will thank you for organizing this. It means a lot. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Martel.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, Mr. Peltier, I've listened to what you've said, and you've said that with CUSMA, there's nothing really that's favourable in there for our forestry industry. And the Trade Minister, Ms. Ning, keeps having discussions, endless discussions. And you've said that we absolutely have to reach an agreement. Now, if we want to reach an agreement, then that needs to be a priority for the 2 governments. So that leads me to another question. Perhaps we're sticking our head a bit in the sand here. But if this government has not been able to reach an agreement, then do you not think it's because it has not been a priority for this government? Because it seems that our Prime Minister has been in place since 2015. We had Obama on the other side, and we heard all the time that they were great friends. So I think we should be disappointed, really disappointed. If it had been a priority back then, I think it should already have been attained. Were you disappointed yourself after the Obama government came and went in the U.S. and it seemed that these two people could possibly have got on well enough to perhaps reached an agreement? Thank you. I think there's different points that need to be borne in mind here. I have the impression that there's several Canadian producers at the start of the dispute who thought that the legal side of things was going to be favourable for the Canadian industry. So that was the path that was prioritised. But unfortunately, that option did not work well for the Canadian industry. And then another challenge for the international trade minister was the fact that the Canadian industry is not always well aligned. So it is then a bit trickier for the international trade minister to work on that file. That's not the case anymore today. I think we are now well aligned in our industry. Mr. Pelletier, do you think that the fact that we've been lagging behind US policies, for example, what's happening with the Chinese tariffs, we were slow to react, and do you think all of that is harmful to actually have good negotiations around softwood lumber? Well, I'm not involved enough in those files to comment on that. Okay, that's interesting, because I think it's a question of leadership here. I've been negotiating all my life. Perhaps it's been different, but there always needs to be leadership shown. If it's not a priority for the US to negotiate with Canada, it is the priority of Canada and has to step up to the plate and bring the other side to the table. So that's why I've got a question mark hanging over all of this. You refer to a small group that seems to be kind of a set of troublemakers in these negotiations. It's the first time I'm hearing this, so could you give us more details on that? Yes, it comes back to the comments that I made earlier. There are certain Canadian producers, I said, who were not 100% behind the Canadian negotiating strategy. So then it made it a bit more complicated for the minister. But I think that today in general, the whole sector wants negotiations to get going and wants the trade minister and the prime minister to get involved, because both have to be involved if this is going to actually make progress. But how come a small group can actually dominate over a big group?
One more person, Ms. Fortier.
Merci.
4 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, et merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to both of you for being here today. We know very well that the Canadian government is very much concerned by this situation and is continuing to support the sector with different investments to help, for example, to fight against forest fires and forest fire prevention. Over 800 million has been invested in that, and also in the transformation of the forestry industry. Great investment, 130 million have been invested in the sector to accelerate the adoption of transformative technology and high-tech products through this program. So things are happening. In the meantime, I'd like to come back to your opening comments. During your presentation, you mentioned that your sector and your partners could actually help and be part of the negotiating approach. So could you share that idea in a bit more detail? How could we continue with the support of your sector so that it can better understand your possible contribution to this? I think that one possible approach here would be to work directly with the current Canadian government to ensure that the next agreement is well coordinated with the Canadian industry, so the Canadian industry would be in line with the process that's set up and the guardrails around this process. Excellent. Earlier in the first panel, we talked about the potential for this market. There were certain references made. Now, within this context, with the US and also looking to other markets, do you think that the sector could push forward with further agreements There's the Pacific market, the European market. These are always markets that need to be considered. But as I said earlier, I do believe that the best opportunity is here in the Canadian market, using Canadian fibres and new construction, in particular with engineered wood and with the 10 to 12-storey buildings that are not yet being captured. We still leave that market up to the concrete and the steel industry. You've referred to potential. Have there been discussions or negotiations on this? I know that the government has its strategy, the net zero strategy for buildings, and all of the follow-up and follow-through on this strategy. Has this approach already been launched? Well, it's already been launched, but there's still not a clear policy that's emerged on this. The policy is not sufficiently, perhaps not aggressive as such. Well, it's not sufficiently aggressive yet to really bring about true changes in this sector. The Canada Lumber Industry, which has got a technical branch, has allowed the Canada Building Code to move forward. So some progress has been made, but we've not been able to actually get a maximum out of this market in Canada. Are there any other markets that we need to further exploit? Well, there's the bioenergy market that's still available here in Canada, and then there's the European and the Pacific markets where there are populations that need new construction startups, and the Canadian fibre could meet their needs as well. Thank you very much.
Both of our witnesses is very much appreciated. For the interest of committee, Wednesday's meeting will be the draft report consideration of the supply chain study and the seafood study. Okay, thank you very much. I move adjournment.